Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome all of you to this ICS Wednesday seminar on India's China Challenge by Ananth Krishnan, which is being hosted by Institute of Chinese Studies in partnership with ThePrint. We are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to a speaker, Ananth Krishnan. Ananth, as you know, is China correspondent to The Hindu. Ananth has an outstanding track record of reporting from China for 9 years for The Hindu and India Today, from 2008 until 2018. And he was again in China in January this year for 3 months when the novel coronavirus epidemic broke there. He has traveled extensively within China and offered some of the best reporting coming out of the country, fresh, analytical, evidence-based, empathetic, and devoid of stereotypes. Today, Ananth will be discussing his new book, India's China Challenge, which I understand is coming out today only. It will be available, so you can get a copy as quickly as possible. I was going through the advanced copy, which Ananth had kindly shared with me. So I can tell you that it's a work of reportage based on Ananth's extended stay in China and hundreds of interviews he had conducted there. In this highly insightful and nuanced, yet lucid and accessible book, Ananth Krishnan seeks to interpret the complex challenge that China poses to India, the political challenge of dealing with a one-party state that is looking to increasingly shape global institutions and dominate the international order, the political and military challenge of managing a complicated bilateral relationship, which is increasingly characterized by competition rather than cooperation and is full of unresolved issues, including the boundary question, as we can see during the ongoing border tensions with China. The economic challenge of both learning from China's remarkable growth story and navigating an asymmetric engagement, which is being revisited in India in the post-COVID, post-Galwan era. And the conceptual challenge of changing how we think about and engage with our most important neighbor, a country in which we remain hugely underinvested in terms of in-depth studies. Ananth's India's China Challenge seeks to partly address this deficit. And I'll say that it's a very timely book coming as it does when we are passing through possibly the most challenging phase in our relations with China in post-62 period. I believe this book will come to be regarded as an essential reading anyone who wishes to understand what China means to India. And as I mentioned earlier, you must buy it and go through the book yourself, as I'm doing just now. Before I invite Ananth to speak, let me explain some ground rules. Ananth Krishnan will be speaking for about 20 minutes, then we'll be muting all other participants. Thereafter, he has agreed to take some questions. I'll have a short conversation with Ananth and then open the floor for questions. You may indicate your interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. Questions can also be sent to me through the chat option. I will call on participants to ask their questions. The concerned participants will unmute or himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep themselves muted. I will now invite Ananth Krishnan to make his remarks. Over to you, Ananth.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kantha, for the very generous introduction and also for this opportunity to speak about my book. I just thought I'd speak for the next 20 minutes or so on some of the themes of the book. And I just have prepared for you a couple of photos just by way of a PowerPoint. Let me just load that up. I think you should be able to see it now.
Yeah.
Great. So, as Ambassador Kantha said, this is essentially a book based on my 9-10 years in China. So I think I should perhaps begin by saying what it isn't before coming to what it is. So it isn't an academic book or an IR book in the strict definition of the term. It's more a book that is informed by the perspectives of people that I came to meet in China, over my 2 stints there, reporting first for The Hindu and then for India Today. So it's basically my attempt to try and make sense of this last 10 years of political, economic, social changes in China. And obviously, it goes without saying that it's been a very extraordinary 10 years. And I just wanted to try and make sense of these changes and ask the question, what do these transformations mean for India? So as Ambassador Kantha outlined, I argue that there's a fourfold challenge, which you can see in the way that I've structured the book. There's obviously the political challenge, where I look at China's internal changes in the move from the Hu Jintao to the Xi Jinping periods. And I think, especially when you're looking at a country that's increasingly confident about its political system and wanting to share some of its values with the world, I think it's more important than ever to ask, what are those values? And I think to pay attention to those values, which is the focus of the first part of the book. There is also the economic challenge of both learning from China's remarkable growth story as well as navigating a lopsided trading relationship. It's very interesting 10 years and how the nature of the India-China economic relationship has dramatically changed, especially over the last 5-6 years, where you've gone from a buy-sell relationship driven by India's import requirements to one where you're seeing Chinese companies invest in India, acquiring stakes in Indian companies, something that has only gotten attention, I think, because of the boundary. So I look at some of these changes as well. Third, there is, of course, the diplomatic and military challenge, focusing, of course, on the boundary question and a bilateral relationship that's gotten ever more complex. And I think, fourthly, what I find most interesting is the challenge of history, which is perhaps most ignored, the challenge of dealing with the unresolved boundary question, as well as the memory of a traumatic war that I think in many ways we haven't really come to terms with, and one that continues to color our perceptions of our relations with China. And in the book, of course, I make a case for why dealing head on with these historical issues is so important if we want to craft a relationship that's productive going forward. I also look at China's frontiers, which I think present a very different perspective of the China model, one that's far less resilient than you would think, based on several trips that I made, 6 or 7 trips that I made to Tibet, Xinjiang, and 4 months that I lived in Hong Kong in 2019 as well. Since I can't cover all of these today, what I'm going to do in the next 15-20 minutes is focus on part 1, which is the changing political landscape in China under Xi Jinping, look at the centralization of power, the party's turn to nationalism, and what the implications of these changes are. And I think that in many ways, this is perhaps the most significant of these changes because everything else in some sense flows from that. I often look back at this photo that I snapped in November 2012, sitting in the Great Hall of the People, as something of an inflection point of my time in China. I first moved to China in 2008, 2 months before the Olympics. It was a time of great openness in China, openness for journalists, both domestic journalists and foreign journalists. There were new laws passed that allowed foreign journalists to report from provinces without seeking permission, which was something that was really big at the time. And from everyone that I spoke to, there seemed to be a sense of inevitability then about China opening up. And here I'm talking about China opening up politically, not, of course, in the Western sense of a full-fledged democracy, but at least a sense that there was some momentum in China moving to a society that was a rule of law society, not a rule by law society. And there was a very strong sense that they were headed in that direction, at least when I first moved there in 2008 and 2009. And I think that I begin the book by telling the story of a very unique gathering that I was invited to in early 2013. And I will make the case why 2012 and 2013 brought such an abrupt halt to the sense of momentum that you felt living in China at the time. And this was to a commemoration on April 15th, 2013 of the 24th death anniversary of Hu Yaobang, who you see in this photo, and whose demise, of course, sparked the Tiananmen Square protests in '89. So Hu Yaobang, of course, is beloved by liberals and progressive elites in China. And for that reason, perhaps, and because of his unwitting role in Tiananmen, is rarely mentioned in the state media in China today. So it was very unusual for this event to be happening in April 2013, which certainly was a very unusual time in China. In the weeks leading up to his death anniversary in 2013, you had a number of commentaries that were appearing in Chinese newspapers that were discussing Hu Yaobang's legacy. And you had one article ask that now that we are allowed to celebrate Hu Yaobang again, our time is changing. That evening, which was really an unforgettable experience for me, you had Hu Yaobang's eldest son, Hu Deping, who was for many liberals in China the big great white hope and the carrier of his father's legacy. He spoke for a couple of hours about his father's life, about his father's political ideals, about his father's legacy. And he shared rare photographs, including this one from his career. And I'm sure you know who the gentlemen next to him are. This was from February 1980, when Hu Yaobang was on an inspection tour to Guizhou in the company of two young officials. To his left was the secretary of Guizhou's provincial party committee at the time, an official named Hu Jintao, and the other who had accompanied him from Beijing was a vice director in the party's general office, named Wen Jiabao. And the mood that evening was really upbeat. And after the talk, someone asked him a question about democracy and rule of law in China. So Hu Deping chose his words very carefully. And he, in the way that many Chinese scholars do, rather than speak about the present, which they can't, he spoke about moments in history as an indirect way to talk about China's current political challenges. The sentence that he said that night that stayed with me was that he said, "It's time we treat the Constitution of China as if it was sacred." And in fact, a month before Xi Jinping took over the reins of the party in November 2012, Hu Deping penned an essay where he made the case for why China needed to move towards constitutionalism as a political model. Hu Deping wrote that it was the reality of China that many of the rights that were included in its constitution were not backed up by laws. And this, he said, damaged the ability of the Communist Party of China to govern. And it had come to such a state that the Constitution of China was just a document with empty words on a sheet of paper. Hu Deping drew a direct link to the Cultural Revolution and made the case that the disaster of the Cultural Revolution was so painful only because you did not have a check on the party's power. And the point that he made was this was a lesson that every Chinese citizen needed to remember. And this article that he penned in November 2012 generated a lot of debate in Beijing. It seems like another era now. But there were credible reports that the new General Secretary Xi Jinping had visited Hu Deping's house. There was a sense of heady optimism that China was on the cusp of something very different and very new. And of course, how wrong everyone turned out to be. 2012, it seems like an eternity ago. I think we forget now that the year Xi Jinping took over was also a very, very much one in Chinese politics in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. This photo was from just 10 years ago in 2010 when he, as vice president, made a visit to Chongqing to meet Bo Xilai, and he heaped praise on everything that Bo Xilai was doing. But what the scandal did do was expose a split in the leadership. And it was clear that there were grumblings among many people in the party elite, especially the so-called second red generation, or Hong'er-dai, that the party was losing control, that the style of the previous government was too staid, that it had led to a sense of drift in policy, a sense of drift in leadership, and there really was a yearning for change. And as one member of the second red generation put it to me, they felt that they had given over the party to the technocrats. And in his words, they were just managers of a family asset. And they felt that it was time for them to take back control of their family asset that their fathers had shed their blood for. So there's so much that we don't know still about the scandal. And it was only very much later that the party actually implicitly acknowledged that Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang were actually making a political power grab. But all this fed into a sense that control needed to be reasserted, and political discipline was the first and foremost requirement that many people in the party felt was lacking. Of course, at that time, we didn't know anything much about Xi Jinping besides his family background, besides the fact that he hailed from the party aristocracy, that his father was a member of the group of communist leaders who helped found the party, and that, like this other person in the photo, that he grew up in a very rarefied atmosphere of the political compounds of Beijing where the children of leaders lived. And all that, of course, changed overnight when Xi's father was purged during the Cultural Revolution. So what I try and do in this book is go back into Xi Jinping's past and try and make sense of what that tells us about his worldview today. I think that one place, of course, to start is where Xi Jinping was sent for 7 years, essentially in exile. And this is a village called Yangjiahe in Shanxi province. And this was where Xi Jinping lived for 7 years, essentially in a hole in the mountain. And there's a lot of writings, actually, of Xi Jinping's from the early 90s and late 90s that detail how his experience there shaped his view on politics and his view on governance as well. So initially, he says he was very happy to leave Beijing and go away from the sense of persecution that his family was facing at the time. But as soon as he landed here, he realized that this rural ideal that he thought he would find was not the reality. He had to spend every day and night digging pits to lay water pipes. And he acknowledges that he barely survived 3 months before he went running back to his family in Beijing. But then the situation for his father had gotten so bad that his advice to him was, if you want to stay out of this, you're safer off doing hard labor in the village. So he returned very reluctantly. I visited this place, and his residents live as they did when she was there tending the cornfields. It's a hard and barren place. But she has written on numerous occasions that it was these 7 years that shaped his political outlook. And of course, all of this was backgrounded by the fact that his entire family had been turned upside down. He often speaks of the purging of his father, who you see here, as being the single most transformative moment in his life, which is understood in the trauma that his family went through. His father was publicly tortured at the Workers' Stadium in Beijing, which you see here in the company of Red Guards, which I just recently noticed for some strange reason seem to be wearing face masks. His mother had to publicly denounce her husband as an enemy of the people. His sister, who saw her home being raided by the Red Guards, ended up taking her own life. So I think she, more than others in the system, has a very deeply personal grasp of the arbitrariness of power in what is, I think, a very brutal winner-takes-all system. He wrote that he had to apply 8 times before being accepted into the Communist Youth League. He had to apply 10 times before being admitted into the Communist Party, all because of his quote-unquote bad family history. In an essay she actually wrote asking, where is the verdict against my father? Are there from the central government? If not, please convey my request. I want to see them. Who do you think I am? What have I done? All I am is a young man who wants to build a career. And what is the problem with that? Yet the lesson she seems to have learned from his father's story, I think, may seem counterintuitive to you and me, which is that institutionalizing the exercise of political power is not the answer to curbing its excess, but wielding it is. And I think that since he took over in November 2012, it's been clear that he has been far more adept than his 2 predecessors were in exercising political power. Of course, within 5 years, he established himself as the 3rd great leader in the party. After Mao and Deng, he removed the 2-term limit that Deng had put in place, and he all pretty much but ended the model of collective leadership, which arguably was a key factor over the last 20 years of allowing China to escape the fate of other authoritarian countries. I also look at how Xi has very dramatically altered the party state apparatus in China. He has given the party a much greater say in running the country, and broken down the walls between the party setup and the state machinery, which had in the past given China's bureaucrats a sense, a veneer of at least insulation in running government and policy. This is essentially reversed a 2-decade-long shift that saw a diminished role for party bodies. He has set up a number of leading small groups that this very useful graphic shows you, that decide policy on everything from national security to economic reforms. Of course, in the past, economic affairs were largely handled by the State Council and the Premier, which is no longer the case. Xi Jinping heads the LSG for deepening reforms, which is now the most important policy-setting body in China. He heads LSGs for national defense, internet security, and even on the South China Sea, underlining that he is now dictating policy in a way that which was previously given to bureaucrats. So I think safe to say that when you look at the recent events on the boundary with India as well, that I think there's very little doubt that it is policy that's being dictated by Xi Jinping as well, since it is essentially a one-man show. How did he manage to do all of this? Now, two of the things that I focus on in the book are two of the single most recurring themes of Xi Jinping's speeches in his first year in office, which is political discipline and ideological discipline. And I think more than his predecessors, he has fixated on the issue of ideology as something that is a coherent and binding element that's needed to keep the party and its members in line. This was clear in one of his first speeches, delivered in January 2013, in his so-called Southern tour when he went to Guangdong. And he shared his observations about why the Soviet Union disintegrated. And he essentially brought that down to two reasons. The first, he said, was that their fundamental faith in their ideals and beliefs had been shaken, and the ruler's flag over the city tower had been changed overnight. He said to dismiss the history of communism was to dismiss everything else, was to engage in historic nihilism, and that was the most profound lesson for the Communist Party of China. In response to this growing chorus that I mentioned from people like Hu Deping, from media outlets, Caixin, Caijing, and others, she said that the first task for the party under him was to resist this persistent clamor for political liberalization and this idea of political reform, which Xi Jinping said in his view was a stealthy tampering of the concept and a misunderstanding of reform. He said, if we lose our sight of our vision as communists, we will lose our direction. And in that speech as well, Xi Jinping outlined that why the great renewal of the Chinese nation was the dream of the Chinese people, and why that was something that he would be focusing on. Now, 4 months after the speech, the Central Committee put out what was then called Document Number 9, or a communique on the state of the ideological sphere. Now, at the time in China, it received not much attention, but if you read it in hindsight, it provides an extraordinary preview of everything that was to follow in the next 7 years and things that we are familiar with today. It says that the most dangerous threat to the Communist Party was the promotion of Western ideas of constitutional democracy, which was an attempt to undermine the party's leadership. And it describes ideological control as a life or death struggle. The Chinese scholar Li Junru has, in his research, pointed out that the most common phrase that occurs in Xi Jinping's speeches over his first 5 years was unswerving adherence to the party. In 2015, he came out with the 3 stricts and 3 earnest rules, which was for party members to be strict in self-development, in exercise of power, in self-discipline. In another speech, he spoke of 5 symptoms that he said proved that party officials were now showing a lack of backbone. These included skepticism about communism, a yearning for Western political systems, and what I thought was very interesting, which was the trend of party members to worship the Buddha. So these are views that Chinese leaders rarely express to the world or in public, but as I was constantly reminded by friends in Beijing to really understand what China's leaders think, pay attention to what they say at home, especially when they don't say those things abroad. The Chinese scholar Chen Li says in his view that Xi Jinping was lucky enough to arrive just at the moment in history when this consolidation of power was being welcomed by Chinese elites. Another person that I often turn to make sense of what was happening in Beijing is Zhang Lifan, who is a historian who lives in Beijing, and his father, he's a Hong'er himself, given that his father founded the China National Democratic Construction Association. And Zhang Lifan told me that the corruption campaign was perhaps the single most effective tool for Xi Jinping, because she knew that every single family, every single party family had something to hide. So by going after one or two tigers, he very quickly had everyone fall in line. Now, as Zhang says, with the centralization of power, of course, there are risks, because risks that have been dispersed by the system of collective leadership have now come on the shoulders of one man. And it is no secret that I think many intellectuals in China have a very dim view of the direction in which the country's political future has been going. And I think most of you would have been familiar with this, with the writings of Xu Zhangrun at Tsinghua University, who captures this sense of anxiety. Xu says that Xi Jinping has torn up the basic compact that had seen political stability in China over the last 30 years, which was, in his words, you hold on to the reins of power and you allow me to enjoy my personal life. In Zhang Lifan's view, there's a reason why the party is doing this, is that, and it's because it knows that it needs other sources of legitimacy beyond this basic compact. I think that we tend to pay a lot of attention to these liberal critiques of Xi Jinping from Xu Zhangrun, from Tsai Ing-wen, from others. But I think there's a case to be made that he's far less concerned about these criticisms than what he gets from the other flank, which is the criticism that he's not nationalist enough. And I think there's compelling evidence to suggest that is a very strong driving impulse of what he's doing today. I think we had one snapshot of that in this now infamous April 2019 Politburo meeting, where the leadership did a 180-degree turn on signing the trade deal with the US, because 3 members of the Politburo Standing Committee very furiously said that by signing this deal, Xi Jinping was selling China. So in the view of Jiang Shigong, who is one of the leading intellectuals of the Xi Jinping era and is from Peking University's law school, this is why nationalism and the turn to nationalism is so key to everything that Xi Jinping is doing. He says that this is why the party declared the start of a new era under Xi, which he says is the 4th era of the Communist Party's evolution. And of course, the next era following Deng's era of growth. He believes that the reason to do all this was because Xi took over at a moment of crisis. And the most interesting part of Jiang's argument is that the way Xi Jinping plans to fill this ideological vacuum is by turning to what he calls nationalist political confidence as a spiritual force to consolidate the entire party. And I think that this perhaps explains more than anything else many of the supposedly mystifying external actions that we see from China. I'll briefly end by talking here about how these domestic changes are influencing external behavior, and I just want to speak a little bit about India here. As I speak in the book, Beijing appears willing more than ever to play a greater role in global institutions, in taking a lead in mediating disputes, and I think most importantly in showing confidence and offering its model to the world. And in my view, I think it's going to exacerbate what I think is one of the key dilemmas in the India-China relationship, which is a fundamental difference in how both countries look at the other and their place in the world. India sees China as an equal. And make no mistake, I think that Chinese strategic thinkers resent that notion. And I think for many Chinese strategic thinkers, it is India's reluctance to acknowledge this power differential that is at the heart of many of the problems confronting the relationship. In the book, I make a case for why this is not new. I think for all the talk from the two governments being two old civilizations, I think that for more than 100 years, this has been a pretty prominent strand of Chinese thought. To illustrate this, go back to one episode, which is Rabindranath Tagore's 1924 visit, where, of course, he was very warmly welcomed by many, but he was also given a very hostile reception by some of China's leading intellectuals of the time. Mao Dun, the Chinese novelist, said, "We are determined not to welcome a person who loudly sings the praises of Eastern civilization, oppressed as we are by militarists from within the country and by imperialists from without." Chen Duxiu, who was a towering Chinese intellectual and co-founded the Communist Party, wrote that we must warn to not let our youth be Indianized, unless, that is, they want their coffins to lie in a land under the heel of a colonial power. So 100 years on, I think, after this visit, the idea of India being a weak colonized power is something that I think still persists within the Chinese strategic community. If it was the British Empire then, and this image of Indians who policed the streets of Shanghai and were reviled for doing so. Today, I think, of course, India is seen in so many Chinese writings, rightly or wrongly, as a pawn of the US. And hence, for many Chinese strategists, I think the relationship with India is not something seen on its own merits, but viewed in the context of China's broader relationship with America, which is something I think that really has cropped up a lot in a lot of the analysis we've seen of the recent tensions on the boundary. And of course, disparaging India's global ambitions and highlighting this power differential has been an argument we've seen pretty much every day over the last few months from China's state media. So I think that over the last 3 decades, it's clear that I think both sides have done remarkably well in managing this relationship, cooperating and competing cooperating on issues like climate change, on trade. But I think much of this was predicated on some sense of a shared understanding of the world order, of a common desire for multipolarity and a greater voice for developing countries in global institutions. But I think the question for us to ask is, with China's changing view of the world, and this is a changing view that I think is accelerating under Xi Jinping, given his emphasis on ideology, his emphasis on nationalism, I think this logic is being diluted. And I think for many in India, this was typified by, I think, China's approach to the Belt and Road Initiative, which India opposed, which reinforced the perception of a country that was increasingly following just one maxim, which is, it is either my way or the highway. I think, Ambassador Kanta, I'll stop with that, and hopefully we can get to other issues, including bilateral ones, which I left out in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Ananth, for that perfect teaser to your book. In fact, you whetted your appetite to read your book. In your, brief remarks, you brought out very well, Xi Jinping's formative years, what shaped the person Xi Jinping, the leader Xi Jinping, and some of the, thrust areas of first, 8 years of his being in office, his focus on centralization and how consolidation of political power has been welcomed, his emphasis on ideology, his concerns about threat of Western ideas, his unswerving adherence to party, his anti-corruption campaign, and also emphasis he placed on nationalism as a key driving impulse behind everything Xi Jinping has done. And then you wrapped up with your comments on how India is looked upon in China, how India's desire to be seen as equal to China is resented in that country, and how India's perception or its quest for the international role is looked at in disparaging terms in China. Thank you very much for those very incisive, insightful remarks. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about what you have said, but let me use my prerogative as chair to pose some questions to you, just to keep this conversation going. And I'll focus more on India-China relations, some issues that you have raised in your book with regard to India-China relations. In your remarks just now, you emphasized nationalism, how it has been a driving impulse for Xi Jinping, how it has been, in your book you mentioned how it has been a binding force, an instrument of popular mobilization. How do you think nationalism as a factor is impacting China's relations with India? Would like to dwell on that subject?
Thank you, Ambassador Kanta. I think that if we look at this summer's events, for example, slightly in a broader context, I think it was, in some sense, a lot of what was happening wasn't limited or unique to China's western frontiers. I think there was a sense that in May and June as well, you'd seen a huge uptick in China, in tensions across the Taiwan Straits, in the South China Sea with Japan. And I think that, I mean, there have been so many theories about how the pandemic might have perhaps exacerbated this feeling within China of China being under siege from the world and having to respond to that. I think the obvious consequence is going to be that it's going to be so difficult for both countries, which I think are dealing with a rise in nationalist sentiment in different ways. I think it just creates such a whole another layer of complexity when you look at both countries needing to step back from the brink, which is something that we've been dealing with this summer. One thing that I found so striking about a lot of the writings we've seen in the Chinese press since June, July, and August is that, especially among younger scholars in China, I think that there's such an incentive for them to take a harder line in the case that you'd never hear from older Chinese strategic experts who look at the bigger picture of ties, who call for moderation. All of that's become such a rarity. Maybe some of that's happening here too. But I think that's going to be a trend that is going to be sort of complicating for us to negotiate things like the boundary question, because the wiggle room for both sides to speak with a sense of moderation has, I think, diminished very drastically.
Thanks, thank you. Let me move on to another question. In your book, you have a chapter, fascinating chapter on Doklam to Galwan, which I was going through last night. In this chapter, you give the narrative of downward slide in bilateral ties. Doklam in 2017 to Galwan in 2020, as seen from Beijing. This happened despite two highly successful informal summits at Wuhan and Chennai in between. Can you share your thoughts on this downward slide which has occurred over the last 3 years? Two major disruptions in relations, one which we are still going through despite informal summits of Wuhan and Chennai.
I think one confession that I have to make is I think a lot of people said that the events of this summer were a long time coming and were expected. But I have to confess that I was completely taken aback only because covering the last 3 years, it seemed to me that both sides had invested so much in repairing what had happened at Doklam. And in my case, as it turns out, a lot of rewriting had to be done because I finished writing this book on August 1st. So I did have some time to try and digest what was happening in May and June. But frankly, I think the sense was that 2017 August was as low as it would go. For me, those 72 days in Beijing were in many ways the strangest time that I'd spent in China. It genuinely felt that more so than today, the attention that the Doklam crisis or Doklam incident was getting, it was daily, it was covered in every Chinese media outlet like People's Daily, PLA Daily, something we haven't seen this time around. And following Doklam, there was a sense that there was a meeting of minds, that both sides had decided enough was enough, which was why you had these two informal summits. And I frankly thought that what we had seen, the outcomes from Wuhan and the outcomes from Chennai, were going to have a lasting impact, at least for the next year or two. And the fact is that 2018 and 2019 were perhaps some of the most peaceful years on the line of actual control in many years. So I, for one, didn't see it coming that you would undergo this terrible crisis, the worst since 1962. But in hindsight, I think that there were some lessons from what we heard from the Chinese from Doklam that we're seeing repeated today. In fact, as you may have noticed just yesterday, there was this reference to the LAC of November 1959. Now, that was something that was mentioned during the Doklam crisis as well by China, but then subsequently not highlighted. In some sense, I think both sides got lucky because of the fact that China was hosting a summit and they wanted Prime Minister Modi to come. In a weird coincidence, some of the previous standoffs as well seemed to have this incentive for both sides to step back, whether in 2013 or 2014, when you had visits that were imminent or ongoing. So from my own perspective, I did not expect that this huge investment to fix the relationship would just be discarded so quickly, just 5 months or 6 months after Xi Jinping's visit to Chennai. I think the other interesting fact that I took away from Doklam was, from a journalist's point of view, was the way that the Chinese were using media, and which now people call with a very broad brush term information warfare. But I think the way in which the Chinese are using media, social media, to increase nationalist sentiment, which we've seen over the last few months as well. I think that a lot of the Doklam playbook we're still dealing with 3 years down the line. But as I mentioned in the book, I frankly didn't see it coming. I don't know about you, but I didn't see it coming in May 2020.
Well, another area where we have seen some very significant developments over the last few months, something you have reported about quite a bit, that is how India-China economic engagement has been diversified since 2013-14, a period that saw the concurrent trends of rising Chinese outward investment and the emergence of China as a major tech power. As you know, in the last few months, Government of India has taken a series of steps to reduce economic dependency on China. How do you see the future of India-China economic engagement? Do you see the trends visible over since April this year to get reinforced? Do you see a long-term reversal to India-China economic engagement? Or are we likely to go back to the trajectory of expanded economic engagement in India and China?
Well, it seems that since even before the boundary tensions began in May, since April, there has been some rethinking in the government on the way economic relations with China were going. But it's kind of forgotten now that from 2014 onwards, when I was in Beijing, I saw that the government of India was expending huge effort in getting Chinese investment. Investigate set up the China desk. And frankly, up until 2020, the government of India was very happy to have Chinese companies pour in lots of money into Indian startups. We had a Chinese company acquire an Indian pharmaceutical company. And of course, you know that Alibaba and Tencent have become some of the biggest investors in the Indian tech sector. And all of this was encouraged by both sides. And I think perhaps one frustration that the government of India had was in its investment pitches to China, it was hoping to get in Chinese money into greenfield projects, getting Chinese companies to come here, invest in factories, manufacture, but less of that was coming. And you were getting more of Chinese companies acquiring stakes in Indian companies. The logic for the recent moves has been cited as data security and privacy. But the fact is that this didn't seem to be a big concern in my own interactions with government officials throughout 2017 and 2018. I spent a year working on a project on Chinese investments in India when I was with Brookings India. And during the course of that research, when we had interactions with people, frankly, the most common response I got from the MEA was, why should we be worried about our data going to Chinese if our data is going to American companies? So I think that there has been a huge 180-degree shift this summer. Whether or not it's permanent or not, whether or not it is signaling in the middle of this crisis, I don't know. But it seems to me that even if you look at the FDI amendments in April, that there seems to be an argument that India doesn't want to have relations with China that are moving in this direction of closer investment relations, a closer integration. it seems that India wants a very specific, narrow kind of Chinese investment, which is perhaps in factories or in greenfield projects, but not a broader economic relationship. And a point that I make in the book is one reason why this big India-China trade that we've had from early 2000s hasn't resulted in better understanding, in increased exchanges between people, as you've seen between China and Japan, China and Korea, was for the very fact that you only had superficial economic trading relations. You didn't have the kind of things we've witnessed in the last 2-3 years of, synergies between Indian tech companies and Chinese tech companies. But I think we've hit a huge pause on that this summer. And my own view is I think it's highly unlikely that it will go back to that, also because there's signs coming out that Chinese investors have become very skittish, and a lot of plans that they had for India, I think, have now been put on hold.
Thank you. Thanks, Ananth. Now we'll open the floor for questions. As I mentioned earlier, questions can be raised through the chat box option or by raising hand. But I'll begin by inviting Jyoti Malhotra, National and Strategic Affairs Editor of our media partner, ThePrint, to pose the questions to Ananth. Jyoti?
Yeah. Hi, Ananth. It's wonderful to see a fellow journalist ask all the right questions and write a brilliant book. So you have lots of answers. But I just have one question for you, which is towards the end of your presentation, you talked about how India and India's strategic scholars who believe that they are equal to China, or believe that India is equal to China, but the thinking in China is that they look at India as the legatee of a colonial power. And also with the ongoing crisis in Ladakh, the manner in which India and the US seem to have tied up, and they sort of are not very happy with that. But my question is, what is the problem, even if India and the US are working together, or in obvious and not so obvious ways? What's the problem with that in China's perception?
Thanks, Jyoti, and good to see you after a long time. I think that there was a very interesting interview last week by a Chinese scholar, Liu Zhongyi, who had traveled to the border. Obviously, the Chinese government wanted this to happen. And he came back and gave a very long interview on the China-India-US triangle to a Chinese website. And I think Hemant Adlaka of ICS had done a fantastic job translating this entire interview. And I think that even if India-US relations aren't really, if we take this current boundary crisis as an example, I think that even if it isn't the trigger, I think it provides a very good justification for Chinese scholars, for the Chinese government to do what they're doing. Perhaps it's a post facto justification, which is what I would say. But I think it is also important because in some sense, it reduces, I think, the incentive for China to preserve relations with India. When I first moved there in 2009, 2010, the most common argument that I heard on this India, China, US dynamic was that India is a swing state, so we don't want to do too much to push India into the hands of the US was a very, very common thing that you heard. But I think it's quite interesting that over the last year or two, there's been a little bit of an evolution of this argument to the fact that the Indians are taking advantage of our fear, of our concern of this India-US alliance, and they're exploiting this fear. And we must stand up to that. So I think that's quite interesting evolution of the way they look at it. But perhaps more than anything, I think that on the one hand, it could give a good explanation for recent actions, and secondly, I think that something worth considering is perhaps they feel there's less incentive for them to not do certain actions. Hope that answers.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Ashok, I'll pass.
Okay. Thanks, Jyoti. Well, we have a lot of questions in the chat box and several raised hands as well. Can I start with chat box? I invite Meenakshi Sharma to ask a question. Someone, can you unmute Meenakshi?
Just waiting for the unmute herself. I've given her permission.
Hello.
Yeah, Meenakshi, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, sir. A very good presentation, and I'm really excited to read your book.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. And my question is that I saw the context that you have mentioned about the China-Pakistan nexus in the third chapter called Diplomacy, right? In your
Right.
book. Yeah. So my question is, can the India-Taiwan nexus counter this China-Pakistan nexus? That's what my question is.
Thank you for the question and for the comments, and I hope you enjoyed. I don't think so, only because obviously there isn't a India-Taiwan nexus, and I mean the China-Pakistan relationship, which I look at in some detail in the book, has a history going back to the 60s. And I think that over the last few years, especially since 2013, when CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, became a very important sort of binding glue for the relationship, that it is going to another level. I think there have been recent studies that show that the COVID-19 pandemic and Pakistan's own domestic economic problems have hit pause on many projects, but you're still looking at something like $20 billion plus that has come to fruition in the last 6-7 years. This is according to a report last week by Andrew Small. So I think that it goes to show that their stakes in Pakistan have gone to an entirely different level, and in a way that I don't think we can compare with India's relations with anyone, for that matter. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing, including on the boundary and over the last few years, I think there's no doubt that one impulse for the way China is looking at India now is the fact that the embrace of Pakistan hasn't been diluted, but on the other hand has become more deeper than ever before.
Thank you. Now, what I'll do, Ananth, I'll read out some questions from the chat box just to save time. There's a question by Kedar Joshi. He points out that China is opening up so many fronts simultaneously, whether it be in Ladakh with India, on South China Sea, its dispute with the USA, its difficulties with Australia. What's the strategy behind it? Why should China open up so many fronts simultaneously?
Do you want me to take some more together, or?
Okay, sure.
Sure.
There is a second question from Vijaya Chamundeshwari. Vijaya refers to the fact that in your book you have focused on frontier areas, and you had also visited regions like Xinjiang and Tibet. Can you please throw light on the role of frontier regions as fault lines in bilateral relations between India and China?
Sure, thank you. Maybe I'll take that
these
question.
two maybe you can
sure.
take.
On the frontiers, so I focus on Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong only because I spent time and quite a bit of time in all three places that I think are dealing with very, very different challenges. In the book, I focus on the securitization of Xinjiang, and obviously this was a trend that was going back to 2009 and the riots in Urumqi. And then another tipping point was the attack on Kunming railway station in 2014. And now it has culminated in this extraordinary internment of 1 million plus people. Whether or not these are emerging as a factor in India-China relations, I don't think so. Only because, I mean, it's obvious that India has been silent throughout what has been happening in Xinjiang, and which leaves you wondering what would it take for India to speak out on Xinjiang if the interning of 1 million plus people isn't something that India wants to voice its opinion on. And similarly with Tibet as well, I think that a lot has been made during the current crisis of the use of the Special Frontier Force and the leaking of the information that they were used. But to me, that was just signaling, and I for one, I would be surprised to see a fundamental shift in how India is dealing with China's internal issues, which we have historically haven't taken a stand on, and obviously because we are concerned about Chinese interference in our internal issues as well. And in Hong Kong as well, I think India's silence throughout 2019, from my vantage point, being in Hong Kong was quite notable, only because I even heard from the protesters that I think that India was one of the only consulates that turned them away when they went with presenting letters seeking support. So from my point of view, even though these are fault lines as you describe it, and I think are very interesting issues that pose serious questions of the China model, something that they are promoting to the world, but something that is facing very searching questions at home in all these three places. I am not quite sure that this is going to really become a fault line in the India-China relationship. I think the other question on the multiple fronts, I think it's a great question. And I think the only thing I can glean being in India now, since I haven't been in China since January, the only thing I guess I can glean from their writings is that I think a sense of, in all of these places, they feel that it's up to them to stand up, that people are exploiting their moment of vulnerability because of COVID-19 seems to be a binding thread in what they are justifying to their people, at least. But I think each of these fronts seem to have different driving forces or impulses, in my view. For example, Taiwan seems to be tied to what has been happening with recent US-Taiwan developments. And likewise with the South China Sea as well. And I think the Chinese actions on the boundary with India, I think over the past few years, seem to have their own motivations specific vis-a-vis to India-China security issues. So I am not quite entirely sure how related all of these are. But as you said, quite rightly, they seem to think that it's their time to handle all of these fronts at the same time.
Thank you. We'll combine a couple of questions. I'll invite Dr. Govind Kelkar, followed by Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay to ask the questions. Dr. Kelkar? And then Arnav Gowda.
Okay. All right, I'll be brief. What great analysis. Thank you, Ananth. But I am surprised that I was invited by China, all China People's Friendship Association and Second Indian to visit. And I met a number of big officials at that time, and I've written a travelogue, and a number of articles came in Economic and Political Weekly based on this visit. And that time, they were very impressed with India in order to deal with poverty and hunger in particularly. And they kept asking questions about this. And so and they talked about India's past legacy and all this kind of thing, but never it occurred to me, never they gave the impression that India was a weak power. In fact, repeatedly there were so many questions about the Green Revolution at that time. So that is what, when did this, when this view changed, that is what I wanted to kind of see, whether India's stagnation in technology and China's rise, but it seemed to be not the original thing. And I met a number of intellectuals also.
Partho? Professor
Morning.
Partha Mukhopadhyay. Yeah, Partho. Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay?
Good afternoon, Ananth, and thank you, Ambassador Kanta. I was just wondering, Ananth, since you had so much experience in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, as to, in addition to opening up a number of international, but of domestic fronts, in trying to integrate Hong Kong and now it seems Tibet. Now, do you have any sense of how the CCP sees this approach of sort of opening up multiple fronts? Said that our stance in Xinjiang and Hong Kong has been passive, and that's absolutely true. But do you think this attempt to put India and its relatives to their efforts to integrate Tibet more closely than it has already been integrated so far?
Arnav Gowda?
Thank you.
Then Ananth, you can combine the three questions. Yeah.
Morning, I'm Arnav Gowda, class 10 student from Mumbai. I aspire to be a diplomat one day.
Good, go ahead.
Can India not openly declare a firm, non-aligned policy position and move away from the so-called Quad with close ties with the US and approach China for a permanent peace and final boundary settlement, as well as at the United Nations Security Council and the NSG membership too? I also asked China to help ensure Kashmir, the issues resolved amicably between India and Pakistan. And I say India join OBAR and also some sort of autonomy for Kashmir also. That's my question.
Yeah. Anand, back to you.
If I can begin with the question on Tibet and Hong Kong, I mean, my sense is that what you're seeing in Tibet and Xinjiang, beg your pardon, I think is a reflection of the fact that there's been a big shift in their policies towards ethnic minorities over the last 2 years under Xi Jinping. If you look at China's ethnic minority law, which is something I talk about in the book, that goes back to the mid 80s, it's actually quite progressive. And you do have different policies in theory for autonomous regions and as well as autonomous prefectures within provinces. But there seems to have been a huge shift, I think, in the last 5-6 years, where there was a feeling that, at least among people that she is supposed to be listening to, including a couple of professors in Tsinghua University who've written about this, there was a feeling that the ethnic autonomous policies had engendered a feeling of separatism among people in Tibet and Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia as well, which you're seeing. And so you had several significant changes in both regions, I think, starting with language policy. So they kind of more or less have abandoned bilingual education. And what I found in my visits, I did one visit to the Tibet Autonomous Region because as a journalist, you're not allowed to go there unless you go on a government sanctioned tour. And the only chance I had to go there was when India and China were opening a new route through Nathula Pass. But I did travel quite a bit in the Tibetan areas of Yunnan, Sichuan, Qinghai, and Gansu. And one grievance I heard everywhere I went was this language issue. The fact that they were unable to learn Tibetan in school, and the fact that you couldn't get a job if you were not proficient in Mandarin. And hence you were always preferred, hence migrants from other Chinese provinces were always getting the best jobs. And this was the biggest single grievance I heard in Tibet and Xinjiang. I think that this new minority policy has obviously taken things to another level with what you're seeing of this supposed vocational training in Xinjiang. And in both areas, you're seeing this move to have mass migration of tens of thousands of people because they aren't able to find jobs, including because of the linguistic problem of shipping them to other parts of China and making them work in factories there. So it's a very different kind of approach, I think, under Xi Jinping in both those places. Hong Kong, I think, is something to be seen as a separate issue, and it has different driving forces to why it got to where it is. So I was in Hong Kong from August to December 2019, finishing this book at Hong Kong University. And it seemed to be that a lot of the problems of 2019 were Hong Kong specific, triggered by the fact that the local government in Hong Kong, the SAR government, I think, did a very poor job in handling the aspirations of people there going back to 4-5 years. And the push for elections. And I think that the protests got so out of hand that in October, November 2019, I think that the central government in Beijing decided enough was enough, which was why they went ahead with the national security law. And I think Hong Kong, there's no going back to what it was pre-2020. I think the other question on Chinese perceptions in India on the 70s, I think that my hunch would be that, I mean, if you look at any data from the time, I think up until even the mid 80s, India was probably better off in terms of GDP and especially per capita GDP. And I think it's only that post-2009, post-financial crisis, when you had this sense of China being in a league of its own, possibly that was a strong stimulus to bringing back these feelings. And if you follow the writings of the Chinese media, I mean, I think they don't let any opportunity go by to point out our GDP is 5 times larger and we spend 4 times more on the military. So I think that's been an argument that we've seen in the last few years, especially. The last question on the boundary and settling the boundary, in the book, though I confess I wrote this before this summer's events, I make the case for why pushing for a settlement is something that India must consider and have an open national debate about. And I think that the events of this summer have only reinforced my view about having a conversation about settling, which obviously requires both sides to give up their claims. In the book, I make the case that the single biggest, I think, obstacle, beg your pardon, is the Chinese view that the boundary dispute is leverage, that by settling it with India, they're giving away something for free, and they're giving away something for which they feel perhaps there are no tangible benefits. So I am very skeptical about the fact that we will see a settlement in the near future because of this Chinese view. And I think that that's why you see them make statements on whether it's on Tawang or even Ladakh. It's not that I think they believe there's a realistic possibility of India giving up these territories. It's more that I think there's no appetite from them to actually speak of a settlement. At least it seems to be the case now.
Thank you. Let me now take some questions from people who raised their hands. I'll identify 4 of them. Ananth, I think we'll have to request people to keep their questions brief so that we can cover all the 4 questions. Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha, Ambassador Saurav Kumar, Ambassador Suresh Koel, and Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. Can I start with Admiral Shekhar Sinha? Ananth, can we combine all the 4 questions?
Please, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Can I go, Ashokji?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Please unmute yourself.
That was really, Ananth, it was very good expose. I think you have a customer now for your book, so certainly buy it. So, I had just one comment, and there was some murmur in the PLA when Xi Jinping took over that the PLA was not really very much aligned to the party. And therefore, if you see the 2015's military strategy paper, there is made mention that your loyalty must be to the party. In 3 pages, he had made a mention 21 times. So that was surprising. But that is because he was purging the generals on the charges of corruption. So there was a bit of resentment. How do you see? Has it changed, or have they already got over that, and Xi Jinping has got a full control on the PLA?
Okay, Ambassador Saurav Kumar.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Anand, thank you very much. And I was going to ask you a question on the internal situation, but I will have to hold it and request the chair if there is time to get me back. But because of your remarks to Jyoti Malhotra, you see, this question of change in Chinese perceptions or arguments you mentioned.
Saurav, can you speak a bit louder? We can't hear.
Your answer to Jyoti Malhotra's question, you mentioned the change you noticed in Chinese perceptions and articulation of India as a swing state a few years back to now the rationalization that we see, I call it rationalization, that India has already swung and therefore this action is justified or a stance is justified, kind of, not so explicitly. I'd like to request you to please put some dates on it to flesh it out a little more. When was this? It is not my, I'll confess, it is not my impression. They never articulated or acknowledged India being a swing state, at least in their discourse. Is it something you only heard privately, or you can cite some things? And when? And when has it is still not a fait accompli that they regard India as having swung? No. That puts paid to the whole thing. This is a rationalization they give abroad. Some of them, Yun Sun and others started it. So I don't quite buy this. But I'm happy to be corrected. If you can please elaborate a little on it. Thank you.
Suresh?
Thank you, Ashok. And thank you, Ananth, for a delightful exposure to your book and the fact that you have tried to trace the formative years of Xi Jinping, which would tell us a lot about what the man should be as a leader. My question is very brief. In the recent times, I'm hearing a lot of comparisons being made between Xi Jinping and Hitler in terms of their nationalist power, in terms of their idea of the destiny of the country to which they belong. Do you agree with that, or do you see the traces of Hitler there? And if that is the case, do you also see the beginning of a third world war in what Xi Jinping is doing?
Okay, Yogendra, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar.
Yes, thank you so much. In fact, I just wanted to make, I certainly want to buy this book, but actually I'm quite struck by the fact that Xi Jinping's father, Xi Chong-run, evidently followed in every single thing that you mentioned, quite the contrary approach, whether it is in terms of the ethnic policies when he was in charge in Mongolia and so on and so forth. And also, when the Chinese Communist Party denounced Hu Yaobang, actually he supported Hu Yaobang. And also it seems that Dalai Lama has a very good impression of the father. He gave Omega watch and so on and so forth, and actually thought he's a good man. Now the question actually is in terms of the timing that he has chosen to actually pick up fights with everybody around the periphery. That's something I find a little curious, because obviously this is something, the kind of nightmare that the Chinese actually want to avoid. And maybe perhaps they feel that because of the fact the coronavirus is under control, the economy is surging and everybody else in a crisis, therefore they can try and gain some advantages everywhere. But I'm just wondering, because there's the other side to it, that is China is very much a part of the global economic and political community. So if you're going to pick up fights with everybody, so I'm just wondering whether this kind of a shift has taken place since, let us say, March, April onwards, whether it's got something to do with the internal power struggle. Thank you.
Ananth, can we take one more question? Nanima Basu from ThePrint.
Yeah, sure.
Nanima, can you go ahead?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Anand, thank you for the book. I've just got the copy. I've not been able to go through it, but my question basically would be, what next? We've understood, and you've given a excellent sort of, overview of the fact that how things have emerged. But what next from now? What next for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi's style of governance? Thanks so much.
Back to you, Ananth.
Thanks. Yeah, all not easy questions. Looking forward, especially looking forward, is something I'm always reluctant to do, as I say in the book. If I can start with the Xi and Hitler question, which I would say that I don't see it, frankly. I think different eras, different countries, different social moments. I think it's completely different contexts, which I generally don't see much of a parallel there. In terms of motivations, I'm always wary to say with certainty why China may be doing what it is doing. Frankly, I think, especially sitting here in India, even in Beijing at the best of times, it's difficult to get a handle of what's happening. You can only make educated guesses. So, for example, to the question of why they were picking with India and Taiwan and everyone at the same time, I would suppose you can only make educated guesses that whether it's a sense of vulnerability post-COVID-19 or whether it's if there are other internal dynamics. Frankly, it's very difficult for us to know what's happening on the inside. And so I generally would be wary when you hear people say with certainty that there's factional struggles going on. I'm always a bit skeptical of that. Especially when you look at the PLA and Xi Jinping's relationship, which is something that comes up a lot. I think for the longest time, there was one argument that the PLA was trying to embarrass Xi and doing things that, that he would not have wanted. But I think from the outside, it seems compelling to me that the fact that he's been able to push through reforms, which he did in 2016, that of a level that no one has done in so many years or since Deng Xiaoping, the fact that he's restructured the PLA, this is not a name. I think there's the fact that you hear a lot of things coming out about the fact that this reorganization is something that's actually happening on the ground, and they've had moderate successes doing it. I think there's compelling evidence to say that even if there was any murmurings when he took over, that he's brought it to heel. At least that would be my reading of the situation. On the India swing state theory, I should clarify that it's not something I ever heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. It was just a trend that you would see in op-eds and arguments that Chinese strategic scholars would tell you when you interview them, is that it's interesting that they often would publicly state, even in op-eds, that India has an independent foreign policy, as if to reassure themselves. That's something that you often heard Chinese experts say. And I just found it personally interesting that I see less of that, and I see more of this argument that India's autonomy is just a name. And I think there's an evolution of that argument that I just see in Chinese writings. And I would tend to agree that maybe it's just a rationalization for actions that they felt that they needed to take for other reasons, whether they were tactical or otherwise. Maybe it is a rationalization, but I think there's a clear trend in Chinese writings that show this interesting evolution of how they map this three-way relationship. Yep, I think that just about covers those questions.
Anima's question?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Since her question was on
what is next for the
what is next? Yeah, I was hoping to avoid that, but I would say that the focus right now would be on 2021, and I think that it would be ensuring that nothing goes wrong before the party celebrates its 100th year anniversary. So I think in China the focus is on two big events. July 2021 for the 100th year anniversary, and then the party congress in 2022. So if I was a betting person, I would just say I think everything they do would be leading up to that, and I would be surprised to see any major changes or shifts in what we've seen over the last few years of centralization, of doing what it takes to keep the economy stable and going, and ensuring that these two big events that they've been talking about for so many years go off without a hitch.
Thank you, Ananth. I would like to make some concluding remarks, Ananth.
I just want to thank you, Ambassador Kantha, for this opportunity, and it turned out to be great timing that it was finally made available today as well. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and also personally, I should thank you for over the years. You've been great in helping me make sense of the place. So it was strange for me to be receiving the questions from you. I usually pose the questions to you, but thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Ananth. Let me conclude here. I'll not try to sum up what has been discussed today. Today's discussion has been extremely rich in content. But as I mentioned earlier, in fact, it's just a teaser to encourage all of us to read Ananth's book, which is a fascinating book. So it's something which really adds to good books, and there are not many good books which look at China from India's perspective. And Ananth has so much to say in his book, so I'll encourage all of you to get your copies of the book and read it. I'm doing a bit of marketing on Ananth's behalf.
Thank you.
But I also hope that Ananth will return to China before too long and resume his work from Beijing, because what you have contributed from China, is something really extraordinary in terms of reporting on China during last 10 years. And this is one country we need to understand, but we have not, frankly, invested enough in understanding this country. So your book bridges that deficit to some extent, but we look forward to many more books and writings from Ananth in future. So thank you very much, Ananth, for joining us, for your very insightful remarks, for responding to a very large number of questions which we had today. And in fact, there are many more questions. Unfortunately, we run out of time. Thank you very much, Ananth. And let me thank all the participants for joining us today and for the interest in the book, in the theme of discussions. And we'll continue this dialogue. I'm sure Ananth will also be back to one of the ICS events before too long to discuss in depth one of the many topics and themes he has explored in his book. So thank you very much. We'll conclude now.